So if you've been on my channel for a while now, chances are that you've heard of my video discussing why I loved Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach. And needless to say, that one was a bit controversial. The whole point of that video wasn't to express why I thought Security Breach was a great or even good game. It was more so a video discussing the idea of allowing people to enjoy flawed products. The idea of being able to criticize something, but not the people who enjoy it. And the reason I used Security Breach as my talking point for that video was because it was a game that was filled to the brim with flaws that I couldn't help but enjoy regardless. Call me someone who is easily pleased or has low standards for games, but I couldn't help but enjoy seeing the passion behind the game despite how incompetent it was from an objective standpoint. It was just a good time for me, and I really wanted to express that in whatever way I could. All of this to say that when FNaF Ruin was announced last year, I expected a similar situation to what we had with Security Breach, a DLC riddled with all the flaws of base game that I could enjoy playing through despite that. Nothing special, but a good time regardless. And yet, when the DLC finally released, I and many others in the FNaF community were very pleasantly surprised. Ruin was nothing like we expected. It was a genuinely competent product with a strong atmosphere, improved gameplay, and hell, even the story this time around was insanely fascinating. I, like many others, went into Ruin with low expectations, and now here we are over a month later, and it's easily become one of my favorite FNaF products we've gotten in years. And that's why I want to talk about it today. Originally, I had no intention of talking about Ruin on here because I felt like anything I could say would have been said already. But after experiencing this DLC multiple times over, I feel like it's something I just really want to express my love for on here, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. In this video, I'm going to go over Ruin's art direction, its gameplay, and its story, looking into what each element did effectively and comparing them to Security Breach's base game. So, without further ado, let's delve into it. Now I know it may be a bit odd for me to start with the art direction rather than Ruin's story or gameplay, but I do so because it was easily the part of this game that stood out to me the most and benefited its horror. Ruin doesn't try this time around to be cutesy or clean as opposed to Security Breach's base game. This time around, a genuine effort has been made to make this game feel like older Five Nights at Freddy's titles, with us roaming and exploring a massive, dilapidated building filled with killer robots in a similar condition. The animatronics are disgusting and all found in different states of disrepair, a far departure from how we saw them throughout the majority of base game. And the locations themselves, which were once full of color and life, have now been reduced to a shell of their former selves. It feels like we're actively walking through the corpse of the Pizzaplex, seeing so many familiar locations reflecting whatever it was that happened here to make it that way. And that is without a doubt the part of this game's art direction I find myself the most fascinated by, the environmental storytelling. All of these locations feel like they have a story behind them in some way, shape, or form, signs of what happened here to make this place the way it is. Oftentimes, it's more obvious, like the locations appearing the way they are as a result of an earthquake, which is mentioned through the newspaper. But sometimes you'll stumble into a location with more subtle signs of what happened there. Signs that can be used to provide new context and in some cases, even allude to events to come. Take, for example, in the opening sequence right before Cassie is attacked by ruined Monty. The first time you play through this DLC, the jump scare happens out of completely nowhere. But what if I told you there were multiple signs in the environment of what was to come? Going into the small room to our left before the jump scare happens, we can find a staff bot in a state of disrepair alongside several large scratch marks lining the wall, implying that at some point, Monty was in this room. Continuing down the hall, we see a similar sign when we look at this gate that Monty normally breaks down in the base game, Rather than being locked or broken in through Monty's traditional means, it instead has been broken into through the bottom, implying that whoever broke it was either a small animatronic or they were crawling. And of course, I think we all know which animatronic is known for crawling if we played through either this or the base game. These two subtle signs right before we enter the pipe act as a sort of warning about the eventual encounter with Monty, making it so the jump scare is both startling but also earned in my opinion. And this moment is only one small example of all the wonderful environmental storytelling that happens throughout Ruin. There are moments like this one which warn us about encounters we're about to have, like scratch marks appearing before Monty, footprints being left in locations where animatronics are going to appear, handprints being left as Roxy stumbles blindly through an area before us. But the environment doesn't just tell the story of things that have already happened there. One other thing that the environment of Ruin does is actually foreshadow future events as well as provide some symbolism for different parts of the story, adding to the experience and making everything almost feel connected. Take, for example, the imagery seen when we see depictions of Freddy throughout Ruin. From the very start, there is a noticeable visual theme at play whenever we see anything with Freddy in this DLC, that being his missing head. At the very start, the Freddy statue we're used to seeing in the atrium is destroyed, with its head having been pulled off with a chain. In the section involving Monty's backstory, we see a Freddy statue with its head being literally blown off by a whirlwind created by Monty's guitar. Plushies of Freddy are seen with missing heads, posters have it scratched off, you get the idea. Now at first, this may seem like some random, arbitrary decision done by Steelwool to convey the horrible state the Pizzaplex is in. However, there comes a point in the game where we eventually encounter Freddy, and you'll never guess what's happened to him.
Are you okay? You need to be functional.
These seemingly random instances of Freddy being shown time and time again without a head were actually trying to subtly build to the moment where we finally meet him, only to see that he's become a husk of his former self, hunting us down just like every other animatronic. It's moments and storytelling like this that made Ruin super fun to revisit, because knowing that this level of detail was put into telling the story purely through the environment made it insanely fun to look for these clues where you can. And foreshadowing isn't the only kind of visual storytelling at play here. During the final sequence with Ruined Monty, where we jump over platforms to avoid him in the water, there's this moment at the end where we electrocute him using a neon sign. Now this scene on its own is a pretty cool end to Monty's character, however what I find makes it so much better is the realization that the sign we use to do this is actually one of Glamrock Bonnie. Now, for those unfamiliar with the lore of base game, it is heavily implied through both visuals and notes we collect that Monty had actually previously killed Bonnie to take his place on stage. So this moment where we kill him using a sign depicting Bonnie's face can be taken as a sort of poetic twist of irony, with Bonnie getting his revenge in a weird sense. It's stuff like this and the foreshadowing at play through the environment that really brings together the visual elements at play with Ruin. It feels like every area in this DLC was designed with purpose. Things weren't just thrown around at random to make these locations feel creepy. There is a story behind them, a reason for how they got the way they were, and a purpose for the visuals they show us. Everything feels really connected and well thought out, and it makes it so that with each new playthrough of Ruin, I find something new that I can appreciate. And one last thing about the visuals here that feels a bit disconnected from my previous points is that I feel the more linear nature of the actual level design here plays a very key part in allowing this storytelling to actually happen. Ruin's areas are designed to only be traveled along a single path as opposed to Security Breach's more open approach to its level design. This essentially makes it so that you're able to take in these details when you're actually supposed to, rather than at any random point you may stumble across these places. You're able to slowly see the story unravel through both the characters and the environment, making everything feel like a much more complete story. And on top of that, the more closed-in, linear environments also benefit the actual horror in Ruin greatly. The horror behind Security Breach greatly suffered due to how open and colorful all the locations were in it. Sure, the Pizzaplex was fun to explore, but everything felt so open most of the time that you never really felt vulnerable. In Ruin, however, many of the locations we travel to feel small and claustrophobic as a result of the level design. There are a few places to run when we get pursued by these characters, and in my opinion, that really heightens the stress of each situation. The more linear approach here benefits this DLC in a lot of ways. It allows us to take in the details of each environment we're supposed to at the right time, adds to the horror of each given scenario by making everything feel closed in, and of course, it greatly benefits the overall gameplay of Ruin. So let's take a look at that next. The gameplay of Security Breach's base game was easily the weakest part of the game to most fans who played through it, and I feel like that was for a plethora of reasons. The game was littered with bugs left, right, and center, it suffered horrible performance issues, and on top of all of that, it just fundamentally struggled with the way the game was structured. Security Breach tried to be a very exploration-based, almost Metroidvania-esque title, with us traveling across the massive Pizzaplex collecting different items and power-ups which gave us access to new locations. And while I really enjoyed playing Security Breach, there's no denying that this gameplay design was extremely poorly executed. There was no flow between any of these areas, with most of the gameplay of Security Breach boiling down to running around aimlessly and getting horribly lost in the process. It was very difficult to naturally find where you were supposed to go, and as a result, the game felt very convoluted and annoying at times to try and progress. Looking over at Ruin, you can clearly see that they remedied this issue by making the experience much more linear, with the main gameplay being more moment to moment and scripted. And while I feel like this kind of gameplay is a big flaw to many people for these kinds of games, I feel like it benefited Ruin greatly. This more linear approach allowed for Steelwool to make each moment in the game feel more special, with some kind of new character or encounter happening naturally as the game went on. You don't feel like you're aimlessly walking around this time, instead there is an easy to understand path ahead, usually with some kind of obstacles in your way that you have to work around. And speaking of those obstacles, one of the other changes Ruin made, which improves upon what was done in Security Breach, is the new inclusion of the AR world. Very early on, we're given this Vanny mask, which as well as giving some strange lore implications, gives us access to a whole other version of the map, complete with new collectibles, areas we can access only through it, and the introduction of Mixus, a new enemy which will be a thorn in our backside through the entirety of the game. Mixus is an interesting enemy that immediately makes the use of the AR world far more stressful than it would ever be otherwise. Think of him almost like a timer. If you spend too much time in the AR world, he spawns in alongside this loud, blaring stinger that plays, and he begins slowly working his way towards you. If he catches you, he summons one of the animatronics, and you are dead. Mixus introduces this interesting element to the gameplay where you constantly need to have the AR mask on to get most objectives done in the DLC, but you're always stressed about when he will appear and whether or not you'll have enough time to deal with him. There will be times where you're trying to do a puzzle and you can hear him slowly closing in on you, making you question whether you should restart or risk getting killed to finish it. And later on, there are even points where the mask gets stuck on your face and you actively have to run from Mixus rather than being able to remove the mask to easily avoid him. Hell, there are even points where you have to constantly juggle between the AR world and the real world to avoid Mixus, as well as multiple other threats which pose more of a threat in the real world. Take, for example, this endoskeleton sequence. During this short part of the game, we're faced with a group of endos who sprint at us unless we're looking at them all weeping angel style, unless we're in the AR world, at which point they cannot see us and begin roaming the area around on their own. During this sequence, we try to spend as much time in the AR world as possible, both to solve the puzzles in the area, as well as avoid the endos, which of course leads to Mixus spawning frequently. This creates this cool dynamic where we're constantly swapping between dealing with Mixus and the endos, juggling both threats while trying desperately to find all the nodes to get out of there. It's such a cool and stressful moment that honestly I find myself disappointed that we didn't get more stuff like it outside of this one area. Mixus's mechanic works so well when other threats are involved, and yet most of the time we only ever deal with him alone. Overall though, Mixus and the AR world in general are a great inclusion to the game. They add a cool spectacle, give us a new and interesting threat which spices things up a lot in most areas of the DLC, and allow for some very unique puzzles the likes of which we never got from Security Breach. I will say, however, that I also feel like Ruin's structure and the AR world are the game's biggest flaws too. See, I feel like the one big critique I have for this DLC is that the linear nature and the inclusion of these mechanics are a good thing, but oftentimes I feel like they could be better explored and just aren't, which at times leads to the game feeling pretty tedious. When we're in the AR world, 9 times out of 10, our objective is to hunt down these different nodes around an area to deactivate them so we can complete a puzzle that they're tied to. And this isn't inherently a bad thing, but because most of the time our only real threat is Mixus, it very quickly feels like we're caught up in a loop of doing the same thing over and over again. Now I know that just sounds like how FNaF is normally, but I feel like the major difference is the fact that the recurring loops that most FNaF games use have to do with juggling different threats all at once. We do a lot of the same things, yes, but there's a certain tension that comes from those games which stops them from becoming boring. In Ruin, however, the repetition primarily comes from doing very mundane tasks, which the game throws at you a lot with very little variation, so the tedium becomes much more noticeable, especially on repeat playthroughs. I feel like if we got more stuff like the Endo section I was talking about earlier, where multiple unique threats are at play, it would make things a lot more interesting to play through. Of course, this problem doesn't really bother me all that much. I am a fan of the original Bendy and the Ink Machine after all, and that game was way worse for this kind of thing, but I feel like it was worth bringing up only to be fair. Most of the time, I don't even really notice the tedium of this gameplay because I find what the game lacks in its gameplay, it actually makes up for in its story this time around. So I feel like we should look into that next. Now, those of you who watched my original Security Breach video may have noticed that at no point in it did I ever mention the story. And that was for a very good reason. I really didn't like that game's lore. It felt so non-existent. Like every mystery it set up either had the most obvious conclusion spoon-fed to us or it was left completely unanswered for no good reason. Vanny's identity was so obviously explained that it straight up felt insulting, and yet one of the most important plot points of the game, like Freddy not being hostile towards Gregory, straight up never got explained. Stuff like that infuriated me, and so I felt like it wasn't even worth mentioning in my original Security Breach video. That being said, Ruin's lore and overall narrative is actually really cool. It feels easy enough to follow that you get a sense of everything going on throughout it, and there is a clear attempt here to actually build upon the story and give us something new and interesting. The story of Ruin starts right away as we see our new protagonist, Cassie, entering the destroyed Pizzaplex after supposedly receiving some kind of message from Gregory. Looking around at some of the newspapers, we can see that the Pizzaplex was destroyed some time ago by a sudden earthquake, and over time, people have come to this broken down establishment to vandalize the place and leave graffiti all over the walls. As Cassie roams around trying to find any sign of her friend, she eventually comes across a walkie-talkie with Gregory's voice coming from it, telling her that he's become trapped in a sinkhole under Roxy Raceway and something is trying to kill him. From that point onward, we now have our objective: make our way to the raceway and save Gregory. And it's through this objective that basically every event in Ruin unfolds. Cassie makes her way through each location, slowly gaining tools to help her find her trapped friend. She encounters multiple animatronics, helps the daycare attendant, has many run-ins with the mysterious Mixus, until eventually things get more interesting as she arrives at Roxy Raceway. See, throughout this story, it gets implied a lot that Roxy was always Cassie's favorite character. She dresses like Roxy, there are multiple times in the AR world where things will change to show Roxy and Cassie together, Multiple item descriptions bring up Cassie's love of the character, and Cassie often comments on Roxy-themed items in the environment with excitement. Hell, when we put on the AR mask, Roxy even appears repaired to Cassie, showing us how she remembers the character. All of this to say that once we arrive at Roxy Raceway and Cassie encounters Roxy herself, the story takes a really sad turn. Roxy chases Cassie around for a bit, believing her to be Gregory because she can't see, until eventually catching up to her and stopping as she realizes who she's been chasing. After this event happens, it's later found out that in order to access the area where Gregory is trapped, Cassie must kill Roxy as she is the last piece of security that is keeping the entrance to the basement locked down. So you end up having to watch this heartbreaking scene where an innocent child is forced to hold the hand of her favorite character, killing her in order to save someone else. And the entire time you go down that elevator, she cries. It is genuinely so hard to watch and gave some much needed depth both to the game's protagonist as well as Roxy as a character. Anyways though, it's after that tragic moment that we make our way to the end of the game where all the story comes together and the main overarching mystery is finally revealed to us. We deactivate Mixus once and for all. As we do that, we break down the door to supposedly where Gregory's being held, but upon walking inside, we're not met with Gregory. Instead, his voice echoes from the back of the room, coming from something else. A robot with burning red eyes and humanoid teeth. We were never following Gregory. Instead, we were following something that was trapped in the Pizzaplex for a very long time. And with that, I'd like to introduce all of you to the Mimic. So if you've been on my channel for a while now, chances are that you heard of my video discussing why I loved FNAF's security What the hell? Who are you? How did you get here? Why do you look just like me?
Well, I guess the little charade is over. Hello, Posture's audience that I was absolutely gaslighting for the majority of this video. I'm demuted. And yes, I was mimicking Posture the whole time. I really hope they don't mind. But anyway, I think this section, I'll just talk about the Mimic in my own way. Where do I even start? Well, how about with what the Mimic is? The Mimic is an endoskeleton designed to mimic what it sees. It uses this ability throughout the entire game, as you find out that Cassie was never actually searching for Gregory. Instead, it was the Mimic with a matching Freddy walkie-talkie that was simply baiting Cassie to let it out. However, its story goes so much deeper than that. One element that makes the Mimic such an interesting main antagonist for this DLC is the fact that this character does not in fact originate from the games. The Mimic is so far the only animatronic character from the book series that then appeared later on in the games. Now, they aren't the first character period to do this. I would say that title either goes to William or Henry, but I mean, this is FNAF. Animatronics are kind of the focus. The Mimic originates from the Tales from the Pizzaplex series of books, serving as the main antagonist of the epilogue stories, as well as featuring in several other stories. I'll give you the SparkNotes version of his origin. The Mimic was originally the top half of an endoskeleton made by Edwin Murray, who was an engineer and inventor working for Fazen in the 1980s. Edwin had a son named David who he couldn't focus on raising due to always being busy with his work, so he created a robot that would mimic his son and keep him company. Things change though when David is tragically killed after being struck by a car crossing traffic, but despite David's death, the Mimic did not stop mimicking him. Edwin would watch the Mimic playing with David's toys and asking for ice cream like David did, and so Edwin beat it with a metal pipe. This single act defined the Mimic going forward. Edwin had inadvertently taught it violence and furthermore allowed his pain, grief, and agony to infect the Mimic. After this moment, the Mimic began killing. When Fazbear Entertainment went to retrieve the Mimic and give it legs, it brutally massacred the multiple teams sent to retrieve it. But there's a whole other side to the Mimic story that we actually have seen play out in the games. Although it didn't appear physically in the games until Ruin, the Mimic has absolutely been around for much longer. What makes the Mimic, well, Mimic, is its programming named Mimic 1. This Mimic 1 programming is what caused the Pizzaplex to go haywire, after it was being transmitted into every machine by a tree with a tiger head inside it. That's a long story. But anyway, when Mimic 1 is introduced to the Freddy Fazbear virtual experience, it results in the formation of Glitchtrap. That's right, the character everyone thought was William's Ghost in the Machine has actually been code that's designed to simply imitate what it sees. It taking the form of William is likely because that's what it saw in the final level of the game. Understandably, a lot of people didn't see this coming, But this is where hindsight makes Glitchtrap super interesting. It's worth noting that in this game, Glitchtrap had a voice. He would often say hello to you. However, he didn't actually say it. Instead, clips from the Tape Girl's audio logs were ripped and distorted into speech. It mimicked Tape Girl's dialogue. Even in base game Security Breach, there's a lot of clues that add up to the mimic. All the recreated Help Wanted rooms especially seem to make a lot more sense when you factor in the likelihood that they were made because of the mimic's time in Help Wanted. All in all, it adds up to his appearance in Ruin feeling very heavy and revealing. This is the monster who's behind everything. He's enraged and he wants out. He spent the entire game manipulating you and dragging you closer and closer to his lair, and you followed him in. Willingly. You set him free. This monster that's butchered so many people in the past, this monster whose sole reason for existing now is to enact violence that it had learned all those years ago. And so the game's final sequence goes as follows. After deactivating the Mixus machine and destroying the concrete wall blocking the door to the Mimic's room, Cassie enters, where the Mimic reveals itself to have tricked her. As it stammers and repeats that it is Gregory, Roxy suddenly arrives and holds it off, telling Cassie to run. Cassie turns to run, but the Mimic is hot in pursuit. Eventually, Cassie finds an elevator and activates it, just as the Mimic catches up. It reaches into the elevator, but the door closes on its arm, severing it, and it watches you as the doors close on it. This final sequence was so unnerving the first time I went through it, especially in how the Mimic watches you even as the doors close. In that moment, it wasn't escape that he wanted. He wanted you, Cassie, dead by his hand. The Mimic is definitely the most violent, aggressive character in the DLC and the base game. While most other characters can be chalked up to mind-controlled or otherwise manipulated drones, the Mimic is the source of all of it, and seeing that he has this much malicious intent inside of him, well, it's definitely unsettling. I think that's enough out of me though. I'll just hand this thing off to the actual channel owner now. Bye-bye. Remember to subscribe to D.
Okay, enough of that. I am sick and tired of people always breaking into my house and thinking they can just take over my channel for the day. It was terrifying when Lankman did it, it was infuriating when Phil did it, and this is just plain confusing. Okay, sorry about that everyone. Now, where was I? Oh, right, yeah, the story, oh my god. So as my unwanted guest discussed, Ruin ends with us discovering the Mimic trapped within the concrete room impersonating Gregory. It was pulling the strings the entire time, manipulating us into thinking that Mixus was the villain when in reality, he was simply a security system trying to keep the Mimic from ever escaping. After we seal it away, the Mimic pursues us down a tunnel where we're guided by the real Gregory's voice, who is waiting outside the Pizzaplex. After this chase, one of 3 possible endings can happen depending on different criteria the player can meet. We either get the normal ending in which the Mimic follows us to an elevator where we just barely get away only for Gregory to seemingly betray us and drop us to our supposed death, the Scooper ending in which we're chased by the Mimic wearing a mascot costume into a scooping room where it is seemingly killed, or the Brazil ending where this happens.
I'm okay. I found a spot to hide.
It's unknown which of these endings is canon to Ruin, but each one is extremely fascinating in their own way. The elevator ending seemingly teasing a future project with Cassie being dropped down the elevator only to hear Roxy's voice at the end. The implications of a scooper existing in the Pizzaplex. Whatever the hell is going on with the Brazil ending, I honestly have no clue. Each of these endings gives us a glimpse at something we can theorize about for the future, and I find them all really cool for that. And I genuinely just think that's how I can describe the entire story here. Like I said at the start of this segment, Ruin genuinely feels like it took everything wrong with Security Breach's story and tried its best to give us something far more interesting and digestible. It follows a natural, easy to follow storyline with an interesting hook, it sets up multiple mysteries throughout which actually get solved by completing the story, and it gives us characters that feel fully realized rather than being one-note and boring. A massive improvement which got me really interested in FNAF's story again, something I never really expected to say after Security Breach messed with it so badly. Despite the fact that I always really liked it, Security Breach felt like the messiest game in the entire FNaF series, which left a lot of diehard fans extremely disappointed. And it was for this reason that when Ruin was announced, I feel like the expectations people had for it were set very low. However, after it released, those expectations were blown away by just how genuinely good Ruin actually is. Its art direction, its gameplay, its story, everything this DLC has to offer shows a real effort to improve upon Security Breach's flaws and give us a real quality product. And seeing this just makes me so insanely happy. It's great to see that there is some actual love and effort being put into this, both by the creators and also the fan base again. It's felt great being able to see the community collectively excited for this series again, and with everything else on the horizon for FNaF, it doesn't seem like that is going to stop anytime soon. Ruin has left me really looking forward to this direction the series is going to take in the future, and I hope you're all excited for what we'll be seeing as well. Anyways though, that'll be all from me for now. Thank you all so much for watching this video if you made it this far. Seeing you here means a lot, as these videos always feel like mini passion projects of mine, and this one is no different. I hope to see you here in whatever my next project ends up being. Goodbye for now.